Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Haynes Johnson, who is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, a best-selling author, and a television commentator. The author of numerous books. He's just published The Best of Times, America in the Clinton Era. Haynes, welcome to Berkeley.
Thanks, Harry. Glad to be here.
Where were you born and raised?
In New York City. I was born there in 1931 in Manhattan, and then my parents moved out to Long Island to Forest Hills. So it's actually I grew up. I think of that as my town, although I'm a New Yorker by a native New Yorker.
And in retrospect, how do you think your parents shaped your character?
Well, totally. I mean, my father was a newspaper man, and I guess I worshiped my father. My mother had been trained to be a concert pianist, but became a housewife. I was the first child. And she not only loved music, but she loved books. And I had a grandmother, my grandmother Adams, who lived with us and would read to me before I could read. So I was very fortunate to grow up in a house in which we had the advantages of interest in ideas and books and conversation and so forth. I look back on it, how lucky I was. And it was the conversation was always there about contemporary events. And so I think that was during the Depression period, and I was a child at the time of Pearl Harbor, and I remember that, and then my father went off to become a war correspondent, and I pored over the papers reading his stories from the South Pacific at Iwo Jima and Okinawa and the surrender on the Missouri and all of those things. So it became part of me. I mean, it was just sort of into me, and I didn't set out to follow his career as a newspaper man, but I did. Mm-hmm. And he was very good about that. He always said to me, he never wanted to push me into anything I didn't want to do. He had been the son of a lawyer who died when my father was 13, and he worshipped his father, but never felt he knew him. He was a scholarly man, mm-hmm. Read Greek and wrote poetry, but my father never knew him, and so we were taught to be best of friends. I called him by his nickname, not Dad. It was Mike. His name was Malcolm Johnson. And I to this day, I call him my sister. I'm the oldest of 4 children. It's interesting. I don't know why this is, but I and my sister both called him Mike till the day he died. My 2 younger siblings, brothers, called him Dad. Mm-hmm. Now, why that happened, I don't know. But it was a very close thing, is what I'm saying. Yeah.
And it must have been an interesting emotional experience to actually read words that were written by your parent. Talk about those kinds of feelings.
Well, it was, and I followed, as I say, not only the war correspondent stuff, but later on, and he was a successful newspaper man. And all that, and I guess I imbued that, imbibed it or something, absorbed it, whatever the description would be. But it was also books, the idea that books were terribly important and reading was terribly important. My mother used to have I've forgotten this now, but when I was very small, I loved to read, and I'd read all night. And I'd take books, and she said, you have 11 o'clock curfew time. You're not allowed to read after 11 o'clock. Mm-hmm. But I still did. I'd sneak a read. And that's the way I grew up. And it wouldn't have been, had it not been for a household in which you had those advantages.
Are there any books that you remember that you read as a young person that
sure.
sort of stick out in your mind?
Sure. I remember as a very small child, the Bullfinch's mythology books. I loved those. I loved the King Arthur tales. I loved even the old children's books that you had at the time. And we had, this was way before my time, but my father had a bunch of Tom Swift books called the Science of Fiction. It wasn't just science fiction then, it was a science of fiction. And I read some of those. I thought they were kind of silly, really, to tell you the truth. But Howard Pease, Going to Sea in a Tramp Steamer. I thought that was wonderful. I wanted to go maybe enlist on a tramp steamer and go to the Cathay or the Orient or something. It was great. And that's the thing about books. They were an opening window where you could transport yourself. And I read a lot of all kinds of books, and I still do. I take books to bed with me, oddly enough. I'll stack them up in the bed. And some I've read over and over again.
When did the thought enter your mind that, well, I think I'm going to be a writer? Or did it happen so naturally that you didn't even make
Well, when I was in grammar school, which is what we call it then, I went to PS for public school in New York City, 101. And I remember I was must have been 6th grade, and we would have these declamation things, and I would write fanciful stories and read them to the class. And I assumed that I was going to wind up being a writer. What kind of writer, I don't know. I wanted to write books, and I wanted to write, and I wasn't consciously thinking of being, I later became a newspaper man as well as an author of books, but I didn't consciously follow that. It just seemed to happen. And I liked it. In high school, I was the editor of my school paper, and I wrote, and so I just naturally grew into that sort of...
Now, the other profession that you have is that you're a historian also, and did this love of history and this concern with history come along at the same time?
It's a funny thing about that. Again, we're talking about family and what influences, how much we are influenced by the environment and the people with whom we're in contact with. My grandmother Adams was very, very old. She was born in 1865, if you can believe that. And she was the youngest child. Her father was born in 1810. And they were from the South, and they went to New York as passionate New Yorkers, but she would tell stories and remembered about Reconstruction and about the family and the history of the family and who they were. And we had a book on my father's side that my great-great-grandfather had written in 1805 or something. So these were narratives. They weren't just boring genealogy, so-and-so begat so-and-so, and they were stories about the American Revolution. I thought that was wonderful. And I don't know whether that inspired my sense of history or not, but I guess it did. And I know even when I wanted to be a newspaper man later, but I always knew I wanted to write books, and I wanted to write about history, and I wanted to write about America. As much as I could, to talk about who we were and what was happening to us. And later on, when I went to graduate school,
you went to Wisconsin, right?
Yes, in Madison, Wisconsin, which and I studied American history, and I knew that's what I wanted to do, but I wanted to combine the two fields somehow. And I've been very lucky, Harry. I wound up doing exactly what I wanted to do, and I'm just blessed by that.
And we're going to talk about what you did in one second, but one other point that I wanted to bring up, you and your father are the only father-son pair that have won the Pulitzer Prize, and your father won it for the stories that became the basis for the screenplay On the Waterfront. Tell us about that.
That's right. I was in high school at the time. I went to a public school and grammar school, and then I went to a private school in Manhattan, the McBurney School, which J.D. Salinger had gone to before. That's a whole other story, but on Central Park West. And I think the reason they sent me there was a boys' school, only 300 boys. It was an excellent school, but my father was a war constable. He wanted me to be around boys and so forth, and have so forth. So I did that. But at that time in high school, he started writing a series of articles. He spent 6 months at least of his life examining crime on the New York waterfront, murder, skylarking, corruption of a massive scale, a reign of terror on the docks. Every pound of cargo that was delivered to New York port, the port of New York, which is the greatest in the world, then still is, was a fee had to be paid to gangsters. And he wrote those series of articles. There were 24, and then another series and so forth, and he called it Crime on the Waterfront. Won the Pulitzer Prize for that. It was I still am immensely proud of my father for what he did, and I am in awe of the courage it took, because from that time, the minute those articles began appearing, we began getting threatening calls, terrifying calls, going to kill us, kill the family, my father, my mother. And so we had an unlisted phone number from that day to the day my father died, just simply because it was difficult. But he kept on writing, despite the fact he was going to be killed, and then so forth, so on. And then he wrote in a book, and he sold it to Hollywood, and that became the movie On the Waterfront, which was made 5 years later. It took 5 years, 8 screenplays, and a whole panoply of people involved before it finally came out. It was a pretty good movie.
Yes, very, very good, and made, I think, Marlon Brando
Yes.
a movie star.
Well, he was a star before that. He had done Streetcar before, Streetcar from Desire, both on the stage and on the screen, and great actor, but it may be his most famous role, that and The Godfather's later, but it has been said that was maybe the finest performance by an American actor in film. I wouldn't quibble with that. I'll tell you a story about that, if not to bore you to death, but my father was an advisor on the movie, and he would go and so forth. They shot it on Hoboken on the docks, and he had never met Brando until he knew Elia Kazan was the director. Bud Schulberg wrote the actual screenplay based on my father's articles. And I remember he telling the story about when they watched the rushes, when the film had been finished, and they all gathered in the room to watch the rushes of the movie, and Brando was there. And Brando was extremely temperamental, and he was going through a very, very temperamental stage. And he looked at this thing, but while they were running, he stood up and shouted, "This stinks, it's terrible!" And he stormed out. And of course, it was an absolutely magnificent performance. Artistic temperament, whatever, but that was what it was.
So we have to cover a lot, and so we'll move on to you become a reporter, and you actually win the Pulitzer Prize for your reporting on the civil rights movement. Tell us a little about that.
In Selma, Alabama, yes. I think I wrote.
And that was what year? That would be
1965, was the Selma March, and the stories that led to the final denouement and led to the laws passed banning segregation in a lot part of the South, and so forth. But I was always interested in civil rights and race relations. And I have to tell you a little, I'm not sure why, but because my family were Southerners, my father got his job in New York because he'd exposed the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, and they were going to kill him and burn down the paper and kill him, and the governor of the state had to offer him protection when his life was threatened.
This was what state? This was in
Georgia. Not a very good place to be in 1925 or 26. And his father, the lawyer, defended Leo Frank in a case, which was a horrendous case, which led to the birth of the modern Klan. So I guess I grew up with that kind of background and interest, and I was interested in race relations. My father was what we would call now a liberal, passionate, absolutely for injustice, and so was my mother. And when the civil rights movement was beginning, I wanted to cover, my first book was on race relations in Washington, D.C., and then I covered the civil rights movement in the South. And I think I had some success, partly because I understood the South in a way maybe I wouldn't have had I been just a New Yorker. I was born in New York and all that. But I knew something about, and they couldn't con me about how wonderful we are to the colored people, quote, or the black people, or Negroes, or so forth. So I covered the civil rights struggle in lots of places, and then finally 6 months in Selma, Alabama, and happily won the Pulitzer Prize.
And was there a particular satisfaction in doing that story beyond just the Pulitzer?
Well, I'll tell you what was this is all very personal stuff, but because I won that year, and it was the first time that the Pulitzer Prizes had ever been given out in person. It was the 50th anniversary of the prizes. And so they decided, in honor of this event, to have a black tie dinner at the Plaza Hotel in New York City. And every living Pulitzer Prize winner was invited. The playwrights, the novelists, the musicians, the historians, the poets, and all the journalists. And my father was invited, obviously, because he had won. And this was done before they announced the awards that year. And I happened to, I was on the Washington Star at the time, and I got the word privately that I had won a day before it was to be announced. And I called my father. This was so wonderful, because we would be the first in history to win the prize. I called him up at his office in New York, and I said, Mike, you're going to the Pulitzer Prize dinner, aren't you? He said, yeah. I said, why? Well, I'll see you there. He said, well, what do you mean I'll see you there? I said, well, I'll see you there. He said, well, Hainesy, I don't think I can get, he called me Hainesy, I don't think I can get tickets for you. I said, no, I'll see you there. Well, wait a minute, what do you mean you'll see me there? I said, and we kept on, I could see he was getting very angry with me. And I said, well, because I won. What do you mean you won? And I told him I won. He said, you're not kidding me, are you, Hainesy? And there was just a pause and so forth. And that was so wonderful, because when we had this great event in the black tie in the ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, and we were on the stage. And they announced that when I had won, they announced that I was only father and son, and they talked about my father and so forth, a legendary figure, and they asked him to stand up, and he cried. That's what was good about it. If you're going to win, that was the way to win.
Tell us about being a writer. What does it take? You've had a number of bestsellers. You write beautifully. You write beautiful books, but also you've been a working journalist. What does it take? What are the skills involved?
Stupidity, tenacity, perseverance, stubbornness. You have to want to do it, for one thing. And maybe it was a good thing of all my years as a newspaper reporter, you had to meet deadlines. You can't say the muse doesn't strike me on deadline, and otherwise you don't have a job. So you sit down and you just write it. And I think that's the way I've always written my books. I love research. That's the historian part. I like to get the research for the books. And then you go through the process of gathering all the material. And then you have this horrendous problem of what do you want to say? How do you do it? And the only way I know to do it, everybody else would have his or her different story, is you've got to put your rear to your seat, get up early in the morning and lock yourself in and go for it. And you got to do it every day. You can't pause. You can't have this week I don't feel like writing, whatever. Now, you'll have days where you can't do all that. Sometimes I'll have a writing day that'll go from early in the morning till late at night, and I'm totally drained the next day, so I just do a little bit of revision. But you've got to do it. It's like making shoes. I forget the art stuff. Writing is just you're crafting a piece of material, and you're writing that thing, and you hope you'll write something that somebody will read and say that was worth doing. And I don't know how to say that exactly. It's great satisfaction. It's frustrating when you're doing it, but the pleasure of having finished something is pretty unique. It's wonderful.
Are you, because you've been an editor
Yes.
At the Washington Post, are you hard on yourself as you're doing this?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because I've always thought I've been an editor. Almost half my career was as an editor in various capacities. And I think I am much better a writer. I don't know how good a writer I am. I'm okay, I guess. Not as good as I should be. But I'm a better person because I was an editor. And you can look critically at other people's work and try to learn how to improve it and help them to do so. And I think you do the same thing with your own work. I know about writing is interesting because when I was starting out, this is really, I'm antediluvian, I suppose, back in the Saronic age or whatever it may be. I'm making up names, but I used only typewriters. I wouldn't use an electric typewriter. I had to pound it out with a typewriter. I wrote 6 books on a typewriter. When the computer came in, I thought, I'm through. I can't possibly do this. Now the idea that I wrote 6 books on a typewriter is amazing to me, because the computer is so much easier, and you can store material or gather it up and so forth. But the process is the same. You've got to work very hard. And by the way, the computer is a snare. You write on the screen, I write it, and then I print it out and go off somewhere and edit it. And then I go back, because you don't see it the same as you see it on that piece of paper. At least I don't.
Now, the latter part of your career has been based in Washington,
Yes.
and many of your books are on presidents, or you've done one on Fulbright. Tell us about doing research in Washington when you were writing a book like The Best of Times, your new book, America in the Clinton Years.
Well, I should say the reason I came to Washington, aside because it was the nation's capital, the center of journalism, and all that, but another great lure for me, a really indispensable lure, was it had the archives and the Library of Congress, and I was going to do both. I was determined, I wanted to do, if I was lucky enough, to do journalism but also do books. So those great treasures of art, and I've never used the archives once. I did have a study room at the Library of Congress for my first book, and I would go there. I was the night city editor, a young night city editor on the Evening Star paper, and I would leave that and go right to my office at the Library of Congress. And I really like archival research. That may seem strange, but I like it. I like to gather material. As I have done more and more books, I hire researchers too. The Best of Times, the latest book, was a product of almost 5 years of research and travel around the country and talking to people. And I've done that in a number of books. You need help to do that. You need somebody to help make your appointments, figure out who are the best people, to keep your files. I tape record material, and then you make transcripts of it. So it's a vast undertaking. Sometimes I think it's too vast, and it's probably not worth all that effort, but that's what I do. Then it's a matter of putting it in files, and then I do chapter files, where you first got to outline. Or you got all this material, what do you want to say? And that's where the editing job, I mean, I used to tell young reporters, writing is telling a story.
Yeah.
You want to tell a story. There's got to be a thread to it. What is the story you're trying to tell here? Whether it's this long, or it's that long, or it's this long, or it's a book. It's the same thing. You're telling a story, and you want to find a way, as best you can, to tell that story. And so I spent a lot of time anguishing and thinking about and organizing and A, B, C. I figure out what I want to do logically that will follow. And then I organize my material along those themes in chapter books and so forth with sub-things in there. So when I get to write, I can pluck out the material. That's the easy part. The hard part is trying to put words on it that make any sense.
To use an example, in your new book, you devote a large section to the Clinton-Lewinsky affair, and having read it, it's my opinion that you've given us a good yarn, a good story on the one hand, but in fact you've offered us a lot of insight into the complexities of the relationship, and my sense is that came among other reasons that you actually did the research. You went and read the testimony and so on. Tell us a little bit.
Actually, thank you for saying that, because that's what I hoped that people would see. We all think we know the story of, say, something like Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky, that woman, all Monica all the time, but the fact is we don't. Who they really were, what really happened, how they got on the stage, what the implications were, what really truly happened. You've got to go deeper than that. And they're live characters, not fictional characters. There's an amazing amount of material, but I think as far as I know, I was the first person. I read every word of the grand jury testimony. It's voluminous. It's this big. It's just page after page after page after page, and then made notes on that and broke it down and so forth. I interviewed people. I went back to every possible archive there would be, and to try to tell the story of who she was, where she came from, how she got to Washington, how did she get the job, where Bill Clinton was, where he came from, how did he get the job, what were the forces that led to the denouement, the scandal breaking in, and what did it mean? Was it just a sort of a silly foible, a tragic, that wasn't a love affair, or did it have greater consequence? If so, what is that telling us about who we are and what our vanities and frailties and so forth? And so that's what I tried to do in there, and I tried to do it as a narrative with characters who are real people and where they came from, and introduce them. I also decided, rightly or wrongly, that I would write about it as if nobody knew anything about it. And I would try to tell it to myself and to readers as though they're seeing it for the first time, in the hope that maybe they would see it, if it was successful, for the first time in the kind of dimension that was there.
You're a man who's observed presidents from Eisenhower to Bush, the current president, Bush. Before I talk about that, I wanted to ask you about how you think understanding a president requires really understanding his times. And I know that you referred to Frederick Lewis Allen's Only Yesterday.
Yes.
Talk a little about that understanding a president is embedding him in his time.
Well, I've always thought Frederick Lewis Allen was a great social historian, chronicler of the 1920s and 30s, and I admired his work tremendously. It was pioneering, and to take those decades, those epochs, which had a beginning and an end, the roaring 20s, ending in the crash, leading to the Depression, ushering in the period of World War, and so forth. And I took that as a canvas and an attempt to do so, and to try to capture the tapestry. You can't explain any of us without understanding the times in which we live. I mean, that's a truism. It's a cliche. It's no great insight or blinding wisdom in that, but it is true. And so you want to put the people in the times that they're going through and how they influences. And if you're a child of the Depression, that stamps you as one thing. If you're of the greatest generation of World War II, those are definable. And you can't understand the people who go through that without understanding that. If you grow up after that in the Vietnam period and the descent against the war and so forth, that is definable in who you are, whether you're for it or against it. If you're in the 90s, in the time in which there's no standing army, there's no draft, you have no sense of threat, you go through that. So that's what you want to try to do for each president. They distinctively, people look back at Jack Kennedy and they say, what a Cold Warrior, what of this, what of that. But at the time he was thought of as dangerously liberal. So you can't understand that without the specter of nuclear incineration, World War II, 5 years after the end of the war, and what happened by 1950, 1955, 1960. It was a different and more ominous world, so you have to put it in the context of that time. Fear of McCarthyism, enemies within, attacks on civil liberties. I think it's all presidents you have to put in here. You can't talk about Franklin Roosevelt without the Depression, and then the war, and same way with poor Herbert Hoover. Tragic poor Herbert Hoover, smart, progressive man, the greatest public servant maybe of his time, admirer of Woodrow Wilson, the League of Nations and all that, becomes tagged with the Depression. So you can't understand Herbert Hoover without understanding that and the contrast and the sort of tragedy that whether he was able to reach the time to deal with the Depression or not. It's unfair to think of him as just this mossback, right wing. He's not. So you have to try to understand the times.
Now, looking at Clinton, I think one can conclude from your book that at one level you're suggesting it's a problem of character, but at another level you're saying that changes in our institutions had created problems, whether it was the bubble in the market or the scandal mongering that came to define what a journalist does.
That's exactly right, and there are a convergence of forces that create this special climate through which you're going to pass into history. It was Clinton's fate to come to power at a time of unparalleled opportunities for the United States. The Cold War is over. We have no enemies, foreign or domestic. We now know we do have, but none like the Soviet Union, the war, the bomb, Hitler, Tojo, Ho Chi Minh, the isms, communism, fascism gone, United States standing alone, and then you have this enormous boom taking off. At the same time, you have this diversion of the scandal culture, and we're allowing ourselves through the red light up there. I'm looking at that television camera. That tells us who we are. That puts us into the place, and we allowed ourselves to be entertained and diverted, and we allowed ourselves also to be quickly fragmented by the times. And Clinton is a superbly talented person with, I think, as great natural gifts as any political person I've seen. Smart, knowledgeable, fully informed. It's not a matter of briefing. He's read, he's thought, he's ambitious, hungry. But he comes afoul of the forces of the time, the rapaciousness of the enemies and the scandal and destruct culture, but of his own character flaws. In the end, about Bill Clinton, I don't think he should ever have been impeached. I think it was a disaster for the country. He didn't deserve to be impeached. He maybe should have been censured or whatever, but people could have voted him out after one term, and they didn't do that. They reelected him overwhelmingly. But Bill Clinton, with all the forces arrayed against him, in the end, just like Richard Nixon, he was the agent of his own destruction. And he has no one really to blame but himself for that. And I suspect, not in his head, I don't know, he'll go to his grave tormented with this, what if what if. So I don't know, but that's what I think. That's how I feel about it.
And you actually literally knew Bill Clinton when he was a student, a kid. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I was doing a biography of Bill Fulbright. Senator J. William Fulbright was a towering figure in our political life, today recognized only as a common noun, the Fulbright programs, the exchange programs.
Which he initiated through as a legislator.
But Bill Fulbright was a senator from Arkansas, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, a Rhodes Scholar, president of the University of Arkansas, the youngest president in the country at that time of a college, comes to Washington in the 30s, works in the Justice Department, a New Dealer, all these things, wonderful figure and all that. And Bill Clinton comes to work on his staff as a 19-year-old college student going to Georgetown from Arkansas. And I was working out of Fulbright's staff, not for him. I was doing a biography of Fulbright because he was just leading the descent against the Vietnam War, which had great consequence in our history. Had Fulbright not, with this great power of the establishment and reputation, he was not a bomb thrower, but he was an iconoclast and he was independent. Had he not led that, I think the history of Vietnam might have been different. In any event, I was there in the office working. Fulbright opened up all of his files to me, and they brought one day a chubby-faced kid and said, "Haynes, we want you to meet Bill Clinton. He's just joined the staff. We think he has great promise," and so forth. So I saw Clinton. He was 19 years old, and I saw him every day for a year and a half while I was doing the research in the book. And we know each other in a different level, but it goes back a long way. So I've watched him along the way. When he became governor, they named the Fulbright College of Arts or something, I don't know. They had me down to be a speaker at the dedication. He was the governor and introduced me. That's there that I met Hillary Clinton. She doesn't look like Hillary Clinton later that I saw. She was dark hair and had big bubble glasses and so forth, a very different figure. But so I've watched him over the years, and then I saw him, of course, during the presidency.
I detect in your writing, and this may be unfair, but let's run it by you, a kind of an anguish, a concern about the decline in the standards in many of our institutions, whether you're talking about the politicians, whether you're talking about the journalists. You just mentioned Fulbright. There don't seem to be as many Fulbrights around these days. Talk a little about that.
I do think, and you're absolutely right, that not only decline, but a diminution or destruction of standards and the rest, and it permeates the society. This search and destroy mentality, the rapaciousness of the press I've already talked about. We've always had a critical press and sometimes a scandal-ridden press, but it's reached new dimensions of recent years, and it's been progressive. And a distrust of public figures and no appreciation for public service as a concept. All of those things were building and building and building, and they were part of the times that Clinton became president too. And I think in the long run, all that hurts is us. Because if you lose there's a cliche, the only thing in a democracy is trust. Trust is the coin of the realm. And if you lose that, if you become so cynical that you don't believe in anybody or anything, or you think it's irrelevant, or they'll all get after you and rob you and destroy things, then you're going to have anarchy and you're going to fall apart from within. And I honestly think that is something, you're right, I do have a great concern about that. And it goes way beyond any one person or event. And it's been cumulative. And some of it is grounded in for good reasons. Vietnam was a terrible disillusioning sense and a sense of betrayal of trust and so forth. And we've gone through Watergate was the same way with Richard Nixon. And so you've had this combination. I hope now, in the time that we're now passing through, after the events of September 11th, 2001, with the World Trade Center and the age of terrorism, I hope now we realize an appreciation for public service. We can't allow ourselves to destroy ourselves. That doesn't mean you shouldn't debate and argue and take issue and fight for issues and have ideological and polemical viewpoints, but you should do so with a larger sense of the common purpose of the country. That's what was missing, and I hope that's what we find now.
Since you've written about so many presidents and thought about them, I wonder if you might give us your insights in a comparison, say, of Clinton and Reagan. How would you compare them? In what ways were they alike, and in what ways different?
The likeness. That's a good figure. Ronald Reagan is the oldest figure to be president of the United States in our history by far. Clinton is the third youngest ever to be president of the United States. So that there's that difference. They're from different places and different times and different generations. But they had one thing in common. They both were able to touch and move people. Mm-hmm. Reagan, in a way in which his gift was as the speech maker, the set performer on the stage, he wasn't really good with people. He didn't connect personally so much with people, but he could ring the bell and he could make you cry when a challenger went up in smoke. He could say things that when you bring bodies home in a calamity and so forth, he could say the things that were that could touch the nation. And I don't mean that to diminish that. That's very important. Clinton was the best figure at moving and touching people I've ever seen. I mean, he could make you feel a lot of it is, I feel your pain, we now say, but he did have that ability. And Reagan had to do it. Reagan was scripted. Everything he did was carefully arranged for camera light and so forth. Clinton cared much about that too, but Clinton could be extemporaneous magnificently and just take off. And you didn't see Reagan do that. Reagan was in private a very good joke teller. A lot of it was locker room jokes and sort of bawdy jokes, but Clinton had this ability to touch, and I think that's one reason why people saw in Clinton, with all of his foibles, which were nakedly on view, all of his character flaws, they saw in him someone that had a gift and an empathy. I think he was the most empathetic of all of our presidents. Reagan, in reality, was quite distant. Distant with his family, distant with friends. He didn't really have friends, and so they're very different. But they both were able to move the country in a way.
What about Nixon and Johnson? Compare them.
Well, Nixon was the most compulsively consuming, analytical, looking at his innards president, riveting in the way he would analyze himself and his calculating strategy and process. Lyndon Johnson was not the figure that Americans saw as a president. He was mock humble and very soft-spoken. In private, Lyndon Johnson was a torrent of energy and rawness and vulgarities and greatness too. They both were talented men, both terribly flawed, both were not able to live up to the crises of their times, and both were destroyed by them. Johnson's great hubris was a sense that even though he knew Vietnam, which we now know from the tapes that in his administration that Vietnam was a losing proposition, he couldn't bring himself to say, we don't have to do this. Mm-hmm. And it destroyed him. Richard Nixon was so consumed by the enemies that he thought were all around him, the paranoia that existed, that he was going to do anything to bring them down, and of course what it did was destroy himself.
One of the pieces that's implicit in your book is the way in the Clinton era there was an abdication of our responsibility and our relations with the world. And that's quite different from the sense of responsibility that was there at the beginning of your career when you were covering Eisenhower. Talk about the erosion of that.
Well, we are in a different America, and there's no way to, you can explain it, you can explain what happened and why we got that way, but when I first came to Washington, Eisenhower was beginning his second term, and the feeling was then, even though the press could be critical and so forth, the country, but people were confident, and they believed in the American system, and they believed in their leaders. We didn't have this distrust or disbelief, perhaps naively. In some ways it was naive. But there was a sort of a basic respect for the system. Part of that was, I think, born from the World War II triumph and the country coming back and the good times of the 50s and the early 60s and we sense of possibilities. But it got eroded very dramatically, and I was a witness to it, a part of it, as a matter of fact. Civil rights and riots leading to riots. Martin Luther King ringing the bell of the conscience of the country, being killed. Bob Kennedy, whom I knew so well, and taking up the lance from his brother, being killed. And you went through this in Vietnam and Watergate and all this, and then the press turning and the country turning, and we voted less and less, became more and more disbelieving, and to a point where you had this, so you could lose yourself in entertainment and not pay attention to the world around us. And if you didn't believe in government, it didn't matter who was in the White House. It didn't matter who was, I mean, of course it does matter, but you could lose yourself. And that was part of the times upon which Clinton became president, by the way. That's the backdrop for the times.
And his not really taking the foreign policy mantle, is that a reflection of the
Absolutely.
times? But was it also a political choice?
Yeah, sure it was. And Clinton, well, first of all, he comes to office there was a recession, one forgets, at the beginning of the 90s, and Clinton was determined to be, the cliche of his people at the time was, it's the economy, stupid. Mm-hmm. We're not going to worry about Afghanistan or foreign questions or the nexus between the NATO and all that. That'll take care of itself. We supported them, we still do. But we're going to focus on the domestic agenda, and we're going to be successful practitioners of the time. And it was, he did pay attention to the world, but the focus was always on, it's the economy, stupid. Mm-hmm. And that's and we saw the outcome of that. The economy did take off. He doesn't deserve all the credit for the boom. Some credit, but not all of it by any means. But there was a turning away in the country at large, and he bears the blame, in my view, not because we were diverted and because we liked entertainment and scandal and celebrities, but the leader has to try to focus the country on the really important issues that maybe people don't want to pay mm-hmm. attention to. Now, maybe you're unsuccessful as the leader if you do that, but that's what great leaders do. Mm-hmm. That's what Lincoln could do. He mm-hmm. could say things that we still look back and say, boy, wow, don't you want a president like that? Theodore Roosevelt could do it. Franklin Roosevelt could do it. Kennedy at his best, and Truman. There hasn't been much of that in recent times.
And why is that? Because there's a focus on the polls, on responding to public opinion as opposed to shaping it?
The polls, we now have all these poll-driven politicians. They all they all practice the polls. They read overnight polls. They get them every day in the White House, every day, mm-hmm. every day. Look at them and study them. The congressmen look at the polls every day, and they have message meetings on what the message is going to be. And you follow that rather than saying, this is what we need to do. And so the country hungers for authenticity, for vigor, for independence of thought and action, and very seldom gets it. And so you get in the sense that people in politics think, well, I can't go against the norm in the politics because I'll be destroyed. I think that's wrong. Mm-hmm. And I think that the great example of that is someone like Ralph Giuliani, the outgoing former mayor of New York City, who had all the scandal problems, as bad as Clinton. He was in disfavor in New York City. But when the World Trade Center disasters occurred, he instantly went down into the pit and became a leader mm-hmm. and said over and over again, and the country and the people responded to him. That's leadership. Mm-hmm. You can disagree with his policies and so forth, but that's an instinctive thing. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't following the polls. Mm-hmm. So I think there is and too many of the political consultants for hire, the cynical image makers, and I hate the term spin. Spin didn't exist just until a few years. That was spinning a top. Now it means deceiving, or you're trying to change the attitudes of the people by conning them into something. And the politicians do that, and their media merchants do it, and you have all this stuff on television that nobody wants to watch because you can't believe any of it. Mm-hmm. I feel that way myself. Mm-hmm.
This actually harkens back to the earlier discussion of your growing up years, because in those days one could be excited and you were, by the images that were created, the realities were opened up. But so much of it now, partly because of the technology, becomes a way to deceive as opposed to a route to understanding.
Yeah, it is, and I don't think it has to be that way, but that's the way it's evolved. And I go back to my father, not to repeat that sort of thing, but I mean, he was capable of enormous rage and indignation about injustice and all this stuff. And I have these letters from him later on when I was the newspaper man, and he was watching me and angry about Nixon and those crooks in the White House and so forth and so on, and angry about injustice against blacks and the South, and furious at his own native country, but also deeply, absolutely, passionately a believer in America and pride and all that. Well, I don't think we've lost that, but it's harder. It has been harder until recently to find that.
And do you think that 9/11 will turn us around? Will be a big push in that direction?
I hope so. I think it creates an opportunity for the country to be more realistic, to be more honest, to try to sort out what's really in our interest and that we must pay attention to, and change of necessity to deal with very different conditions, some threatening in a sense of obvious terrorism, life or death threatening, others economic threatening, others disparities in the world. And it's not a matter of romance or nobility or any of that, but it's in our interest to do so. Politics is self-interest, and that's not a bad thing. That self-interest for a country ought to be what's the best thing for us to do as a people. And I think that's the test of not just the political people we elect, but the citizens who either vote or don't, who pay attention and are informed or are not, the media which reports on and gives you information or doesn't. I think that's the test.
So in a way, life in the bubble makes us irresponsible, but life under pressure, as we now are, may enhance our ability to respond in a way that's
I think it has. I think it is an opportunity. I don't know if it's going to last. I am hopeful it will, and that's a great opportunity for the country and the future.
And it seems that your profession, journalism, is meeting that challenge in the aftermath.
I'm very proud of what I see of my business, the news business, has done since 9/11. Not all, obviously, but you can't generalize. But there's been some of the best journalism in my lifetime. Courageous, enterprising, absolutely, and helping you understand the forces that exist in the Islamic world, what the conditions are, what the challenges are, what the realities are. Under great difficulty, and I think that's wonderful. We didn't see much of that before, and we're now paying more attention to that, and the country wants that, and so the respect for the news media, at least for now, has risen along with that of public service and the government. That says to me, again, those are opportunities for us to build on it if we're up to seizing that chance.
Students might watch this tape in a course or wherever, and what...
God help them, God help them.
Well, what advice would you like to put on the table for students, A, preparing for the future, but also insights that you have drawn from the story that you've just told us about your own life and the work that you've done?
But I think one thing that Americans, I hope that this is not too pompous, but being informed is very hard work. There is enormous information in this society across the board about events that are occurring that are shaping our lives, whether it's cloning or scientific or technological or so economics or changes in the world and disparities and have-not cultures and global warming. It's there if you want it. It's there in even the most medium of the medium outlets. But it's hard work. And it is a test of our citizens whether they can fulfill the responsibility. They have a responsibility, too, to inform themselves and pay attention to things because they are going to affect them. And the absence of it, on the one hand, creates the opportunity for people either to float through the times and bubbles burst, or it creates another opportunity for making mistakes and stumbling into tragedies like 9/11, not paying attention to threats that we face. So I think that's number one. That's a big one. The other is, going back to what I tried to say earlier, I just can't imagine not reading. It's wonderful to have the internet and the ability to reach information. It's great to have television transporting us into our living rooms, seeing scenes around the world from space. That's magnificent. But there's nothing like the labor of words that might help you give a little deeper context. I hope we don't lose that.
And I assume in that reading there should be history, right?
I'm a great, yes. If you don't know the context of the times you live in and what happened before it, how you got to here, the old Santayana quote, you know, those who do not learn the lessons of history are doomed to repeat them. And that's the mistakes and tragedies. And so if we don't learn from the lessons, then we just repeat them. And that's not in anybody's interest.
On that note, we want to thank you very much for taking the time to come to Berkeley and talk to us about your life and your work. Thank you, Haynes.
I enjoyed it.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.